everything happens for a reason. This is what the Ecclesiastes says, a time for everything. Do you know that there's a time for everything? There is a time for everything. And some people in your lives, you probably think, where does this come from? Why is this all happening? But there is a time for everything. I think everything happens in the right timing in your life. Ecclesiastes 3, it says there is a season, a time appointed for everything. For everything. There is a season and a time appointed for everything. There's a time for every delight and event or purpose under heaven. Everything happens for a reason. This is what the Ecclesiastes says, a time for everything. So I'm going to read this out to you. And it's a time to be born, a time to die, time to plant, and a time to uproot what needs to be planted. There's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. There's a time to throw away and there's a time to gather stones. There's a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing. There's a time to search and a time to give up as lost. There's a time to keep and a time to throw away. There's a time to tear apart and there's a time to sew together. A time to keep silent and there's a time to speak. There's a time to love and a time to hate. There's a time for war and there's a time for peace. That is so deep. So deep. And you see here in verse thing, there's a time to be born and there's a time to die. So everything has a purpose. There is a time where you was born and there's a time that you're going to die. Everything has its own timing. That's what I'm getting from this. Everything has its own timing. So every event that's happening in your life is under a timing. And as it says here, there is a season for everything and a time for every delight and event or purpose under heaven. So all this is all under heaven. There's an appointed time for every situation. And it says there's a time to weep and a time to laugh. There's a time where you will go through mourning and grieving and weeping and feeling sorrow. But there's also a time in your life where you're going to laugh and you're going to be full of joy. There's a time for laughter. There's a time to speak and a time to keep quiet. There's a time where you'll have these moments in life where you're just silent, when you just think, I'll shut up. There's a time for that. Everything has its right timing. There's a time to embrace, but a time to refrain from embracing. Everything has its own timing under heaven. And we'll all have an appointed time. I had a time and a birthday. I had a time that God knew that I was going to be born at that time on that day. That was my appointed time. But I've also got an appointed time which I'm going to die. There is a time and a day that I'm going to leave this earth. Everything has an appointed time. So when you're going through the roughest things in your life, just know that everything has an appointed time and nothing lasts. It does shift off. It's not going to last forever because everything has an appointed timing. So I hope you're blessed by this. In Ecclesiastes 3, verse 1, go and read it and stay blessed.